Hey y'all, and today's a little bit about painting with acrylics and how specifically to get your acrylics to look more like those beautiful, luscious oil paintings. So to start off with a little bit of background, my first medium is acrylic paint, and I always think of it like it's kind of like my mother tongue in a way. It's not the best comparison, but it's whenever I think in paintings, I think in acrylic, and that's because I learned in college how to paint with acrylics. It was the first time I ever painted. And the thing about our college was our art center was a little building kind of on the outskirts of campus, and it was a converted bottling factory. It was very aesthetic. However, it had no ventilation. And so because of this, oil painting wasn't an option. And my painting professor was a very skilled oil painter who, learned from the School of Visual Arts in New York for his master's. And so he was this great, super prolific oil painter. And so a lot of the ways he taught us to paint and approach our medium was as though we were painting with oil. So for me, there's two key ways to make your acrylic paintings look a little bit more like an oil painting. The first is through implementing the lean to fat rule. The nice thing about acrylic is that you don't have to implement this rule. It's really a rule designed for other mediums, specifically oil paint, because with oil, it doesn't dry or evaporate in order to fully finish. It oxidizes, which is a slightly different chemical process to evaporation that you would get in, say, watercolor or acrylic. Here, briefly, I'll pivot and say that I'm using this flow aid to thin out my paint as though I was using a solvent. You can do this with water, although it does cause a little bit of a lack of integrity in the acrylic. Whenever you add water to your acrylic, at some point you hit a threshold where the bonds between the pigments and the polymers, which is the binder in acrylic paint, become so separated out that the pigment becomes exposed and it doesn't hold up as well. The pigment can kind of flake off. If you've ever used water and acrylic to create a wash, you can do that, but you're putting yourself at a risk of the paint eventually sort of flaking. So it is a bit of a risk, and that's why I prefer to use sort of an additive to thin out my paint. And I do my first layers thin, and then as I go, I build up to a thicker paint. I paint with a heavy body acrylic paints, which, as you can see here, I'm mixing out the color of my Topo Chico bottle. It's very thick, it's not quite super impasto. Like, for example, oil paint straight from the tube has more of a toothpaste consistency. This is maybe a little bit of a looser viscosity than that. But by adding other mediums, something like a matte gel, for example, you can get that really toothpastey consistency. And one of the ways I'll implement that is my last couple steps of my painting, I will add that in. So acrylic paint is really hardy. You don't have to worry about the lean to fat rule. However, if you're wanting your acrylics to not look sort of flat and like a little graphic, and that's not necessarily bad for some, obviously flat and graphic has its time and place. But, if you are wanting to have sort of this like painterly oil painting kind of finish, then leaning into that technique is going to help you to create that effect. And so I will start out with my first layers pretty thin, almost wash-like, and then I'll obviously use that thinner, the flow additive to thin out my paint when I do my redraw lines. And then as my painting develops, I'll add thicker and thicker layers of paint. And because of that, you get these lovely little globs and brush marks that I think really evoke oil painting. And I will say I paint pretty much 50-50 split between oil and acrylic. And sometimes I'll have a hard time if I look back at my paintings, let's say I'm organizing them, telling which one is which. I'm pretty good at it because I have a decent memory for that kind of thing specifically. But my husband never knows. It'll be funny because he'll be carrying around a painting so gingerly, trying not to touch it, and I'll have to tell him, oh, that's acrylic. It's been dried for days. So, you really can, in how you approach your painting, sort of change the way the finish looks. The other important thing, if you're trying to create a painterly oil painting looking acrylic painting, is minding your chroma or your color intensity. So color intensity just means, if it's high intensity, it's going to be paint straight from the tube, a really bright red or neon, almost like a yellow or bright green. And low chroma is going to be more of your grays and browns and, more muted violets and things like that, something that's going to be a little more muted. And the thing with oil paint is, especially if you don't fully let your layers cure, whenever you add more color, it's going to mix with the color underneath it if it's still wet, and it's going to create something called mud. I've heard it used as a pejorative mostly because most of the time, if you're wanting to build up to these beautiful colors, if you have muted colors underneath or even opposite colors underneath, what can end up happening is, let's say you're trying to paint this red Kool-Aid color, and let's say that my green underpainting was still wet, I would never be able to get this vibrancy of the acrylic unless I fully let that layer dry. And so because of that, oil painters tend to start really vivid and kind of blend their way down, either intentionally or unintentionally. And acrylic painters, on the other hand, have kind of the inverse problem. There's this tendency to want to go in really bright and capture the bright colors at first, but it can get really out of your control, because if anyone has painted with like a bright background, it's really hard to go the other direction and make things more muted. For example, if you're painting someone's skin tones, and let's say they have nice oranges in their skin tone, if you start with like a neon, like artificial orange as your underlayer, the first time you go in with those skin color choices, even if they're like perfect on your palette and they look really accurate, by putting it on a really bright artificial orange, it's going to make it seem really muted. All that to say, it's easier to work as an acrylic painter starting from more muted colors. I always tell my students, make it a little duller and more muted than you think. Another trick here is using one dirty brush for like the majority of your first layer. Because that brush is going to hold on to all of the different pigments you've used, you probably won't be able to create the really vivid colors. It's kind of like cheating the mud thing that happens with oil paint, right? Instead of it happening on canvas, because your canvas dries so quickly, your brush stays pretty moist and compact, and so you can use those complement colors to prevent yourself from painting really, really vivid right out of the gate. And then as your painting goes on, assuming you started with something more muted, you can slowly crank up the intensity and the chroma in a way that makes you feel like you have control and it hasn't gotten away from you and gotten really flat. The last thing I'll say on that is, so many painters who are attracted to painting for the purpose of wanting to play around with bright, beautiful colors, will often sort of end up trapping themselves, because if everything is super intense and bright and there's nothing kind of neutral, it's really hard to get those bright colors to really pop. It's not impossible. It just takes some finessing and some expertise to know how to do it. And so let's say you have a painting and it's, bright, beautiful purple flowers. If your green foliage around it is similar in chroma, you're never going to get those purple flowers to really pop unless you make your foliage, the green leaf color, a more muted green. And better yet, if you make the green foliage muted and a little bit yellow, which is the opposite of purple, that green is going to play a great supporting character role to those purple flowers. And you don't have to push the intensity of the purple because you have all the color around it pulling in the opposite direction. All that to say, I think if you keep those two key ideas in your pocket when you're painting with acrylic, the working from lean to fat and building up your texture and your viscosity as you work through your painting, as well as starting as muted as possible and slowly working your way up as you layer, that's really, for me, the way to combat the flatness that acrylic can sort of fall into if you're not careful. If you guys have any other questions about how to handle acrylic paint, let me know. I've been playing around so much with medium recently. I am putting the finishing touches on a how to paint solvent-free oil painting demo. I recently got a tour of the Liquitex factory and got to see the acrylic paints up close. I've also been trying out these completely non-toxic natural acrylic paints by Natural Paints, and they have no plastic in them. It's like a soy derivative, and they work just like acrylic paints. So I'm always really excited about mediums and what's going on and new advancements, etc. So if you have any questions, let me know. And in the meantime, keep your eye out for those videos. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this come together. I know I didn't talk too much about exactly what I was doing in each step, but I do have other tutorials where I do that if you want to see those. More specifically, my most recent YouTube videos have been kind of talk through demos. So don't worry, I talk through all of my steps in depth. I also have a 7-week content plan for how to paint for absolute beginners coming out on YouTube in the following months. I'm really excited for that. Thank you so much for watching. Again, take care and happy creating.